Good morning. Welcome to our panel on Rethinking a Sustainable World. My name is John Fraher, Senior Executive Editor at Bloomberg. The COVID pandemic has shifted priorities globally and upended the plans of almost every major business in the world. In this solution session, we'll talk with some of the world's leading sustainability experts about how COVID has changed the sustainability agenda and their thinking about climate change. How are their priorities changing, and what opportunities, solutions, and challenges do they see for the future? With me to discuss these themes are Ezgi Barcenas, Global Vice President of Sustainability at AB InBev, Barry Parkin, Chief Procurement and Sustainability Officer at Mars, and Mindy Lubber, CEO and President at Ceres, a nonprofit that seeks to mobilize the most influential investors and companies to tackle challenges like climate change, water scarcity, and pollution. So Ezgi, let me start with you. Your executives, I'm sure, like executives all over the world, have been dealing with unprecedented challenges this year as they see the impact of the economic crash on their businesses. How much of a challenge has it been for you making sure that your CEO and executives in the C-suite are also keeping their eye on the medium to long-term sustainability agenda, while also at the same time dealing with this incredible crisis that they're facing?
Yeah, great question. Thank you, and thanks for having me on this panel today. So as you said, we're all facing unprecedented times. Over 6 months later, it still feels unprecedented, and around the world, we are feeling the challenges everywhere. At AB InBev, as the leading brewer, we've got operations across nearly 50 markets around the world, and we're feeling it in our value chain and in our communities. But we continue to learn and adopt. And we remain as committed to sustainable development and inclusive economic growth as ever, because our products rely on healthy environments and thriving communities. And now more so than ever, we need both of those. And while we may have shifted our focus on short-term actions to ensure safety and well-being of our employees and our communities, we're looking, our eyes are on the horizon, so that we can take those learnings and build into the future. And we make sure that, we're continuing to inform and influence with these learnings our long-term vision and our efforts, so that we can continue to build for resilience and business continuity. So for us, while we may have shifted priorities early on to ensure some short-term actions, we're very much still focused on the future and that long-term mindset.
And is this a conversation that sometimes you found, difficult to have with senior executives, in the sense that, obviously they're trying to work on a million things and in the middle of this crisis? Have you experienced? I mean, I can only imagine when you sort of try to sit down with your executives, pointing out these long-term challenges. There must be some people who say, "Come on, this isn't the time. We've got this massive crisis to deal with. What are you talking about here?" How do you deal with that sort of reaction, if indeed you get it?
We're actually fortunate at ABI that we don't get it. I think much like Mars, and Barry can speak to this as well, sustainability is truly integrated into our business. It sits within our procurement function, procurement organization. So our sustainability efforts are really truly all about ensuring that supply security, that business continuity, and the value chain resilience. So ultimately, they make business sense. So that's why we haven't received any of the, any expected backlash that you may think.
And Barry, how have you experienced it? Is it the same way at Mars? When again you start having these conversations with the C-suite, are there people? Do you actually have to spend any time persuading people that no, actually this is as important? This medium to long-term sustainability push is as important as these immediate crises that we're dealing with as a company.
Yeah. I think arguably it's helped. What everybody was focused on in the first weeks and months was, the security of the supply chain, and it got everybody thinking about the supply chain. We've 150 factories around the world, with raw materials and packaging coming from all countries around the world, and so there was this intense focus on, can we keep running? And probably it was a huge education opportunity for many of our general managers and senior execs about what was really going on in these supply chains. So as we looked at those supply chains, we were super focused on where's the weakest link, And sometimes that was far away, right at the start of the value chain, and with an agricultural business, often it was a conversation about the farmers, and are the farmers going to be able to harvest the crop, or are the farmers what condition state as the farming communities in? Sometimes nearer, in fact. Sometimes it was about processing in the developed world. We're in the pet food business, and we buy meat, animal proteins from meat processing plants, and you all saw the issues that was in the developed world in meat processing plants. So it was a really intense conversation about where's the weakest link in your supply chain, which is the essence of sustainability, frankly. So as we sought to understand that, then it was a case of what do we need to do now and what do we need to do later. But I've also got an example outside of the company. We're doing a lot of work to build coalitions of action on different sustainability topics. And one that I've been working on a lot in the last months is on plastic waste. And, we've been bringing together the 30 or 40 companies to work on that issue through the Consumer Goods Forum, and having regular discussions with the CEOs of those 30 or 40 businesses. And I think it's actually been easier to get CEO time the last 6 months than it was before. And it's somewhat ironic, isn't it? They're all managing major crisis. But maybe it's the fact that they've not been traveling so much and have had time to think and reflect on this. So I think it's been easier to get CEO time in the last 6 months.
And do you think it's easier now than might have been, say, 10 years ago? Do you think this obviously the sustainability agenda has been with us, has been gathering momentum, especially in the last few years? Do you think it's easier to get people's attention now than it would have been, after the last financial crisis?
I think for sure. Yeah, absolutely. And, more and more companies are trying to, find their unique purpose, and sustainability is often at the heart of that. Within our company, we've spent a lot of time with our stakeholders, our shareholders. It's a private company, but in defining how we want to set up for the next 100 years of the company. And we've developed this compass, which is our version of a balanced scorecard, where we are putting equal emphasis on financial and non-financial targets. And we've launched that in the last 6 months. So, we've continued to sort of set the business up. And there's some really interesting stuff going on around that, whereas we're trying to pivot executive remuneration from just focused on financials to also non-financial targets. So, we've got executive bonuses tied to our greenhouse gas footprint, our extended Scope 3 greenhouse gas footprint now. And so, we're trying to put those sort of foundations in place for the future.
Yes, that's an interesting, important point, which I'll get back to later on in the conversation. But Mindy, I'd like to turn to you now on a similar sort of question. How have you noticed how has the conversation changed? You and your organization obviously spent a lot of time talking to banks, trying to get them to change their behavior, trying to get them to think about what they invest in, try perhaps to think about how they can invest in a more sustainable way. And of course, going into this crisis, there was a lot of talk from some of the big banks about cutting back on investments in fossil fuels, etc. Is your experience similar to Ezgi and Barry, in the sense that even though banks have been dealing with a whole multitude of crises since the COVID crash happened, do you still feel that commitment to the sustainability agenda is as strong as it was 6 months ago?
I'm going to answer a few of your questions. And we work with about 120 companies and 180 investors. And the companies are in all sectors of the economy. The first answer is, compared to 10 years ago, when sustainability was seen as something cute you might deal with, but really not part of the core business, we've come a million miles. Companies really get, or at least the largest companies, publicly traded, public-facing leadership companies like Mars, like my colleagues, that addressing sustainability is part of addressing profits and making a business and being a successful company. So we've come an enormous way. At the very beginning of COVID, I'd say the first 2 months, there was a slowdown in activity on sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody in the world was getting their bearings, literally everybody, business people, investors, consumers. But I would say it came back pretty quickly. And what the it is the emergence of passion and imperative to act on climate change, on water shortages, and other things. And COVID was an interesting lesson. COVID showed us what systemic risk looks like when you have something the size of the pandemic and how it has disrupted human lives, resources, our economy. It was the perfect example, and not a good one to be sure, to say climate change will be worse and will disrupt our system in multiple ways the way COVID has. And getting in front of it and acting before rather than after is quite important. And I want to say one other thing. Climate change is not a medium-term and long-term problem anymore. I wish it were. It's today. I mean, for any of us who turn our TVs on or pick up the newspaper or read it online, the western part of the United States right now is on fire, literally on fire. Washington State, Oregon, California are seeing fires unlike anything, caused by climate-related impacts, both the temperature and the dryness, and we haven't even begun to get on top of it. And so I think finally, and it will never be enough, but finally it's sinking in that addressing climate change and other sustainability imperatives are a matter for now, for yesterday, for last week, certainly for tomorrow, and we can't put it off any longer. Putting it off just makes the problem worse. If we have 3 states on fire now, some of our largest states, we'll have 10. We have hurricanes that are about to hit some of our southern states, including Florida, Louisiana, Mississippi, or Florida and Louisiana. All of those are made worse by climate. So I think the imperative and understanding to act is greater now. We're finding more interest at the board level, corporate boards, at the CEO level, and full integration into what companies do and the goals that they set.
Can you think of just it's obviously it's very useful, I think, for our viewers to sort of grapple with these issues in terms of concrete examples. Can you think of some concrete examples from the last 3 or 4 months that underscore to you just how COVID is rather than actually distracting people from the importance of the issues that you're talking about, has actually make them more focused and that show how they're actually acting on this?
Sure. And here's a couple of examples, and they're very different. First, corporate examples. The number of companies who are stepping up and saying, we will get to net zero emissions, not by 2050, which more was the accepted number even last year. It's now 2040. That's the challenge. Amazon's challenging other companies. Apple is setting up to do this. Microsoft is, certainly my colleagues on this call. The goals that are being set with very clear metrics on how to reach those goals are coming far more fast and furious than ever before. So we've probably seen 20 companies in the last 3 months step up further on climate than they might have in the past. But another implication is the world's going to see about 10 or 12 trillion dollars, that's trillion with a T, coming into our economy. People are looking at it as a way to mitigate or deal with the systemic harm from COVID. How do we rebuild our economy? Part of that money will go to make people whole, make sure restaurants, small businesses, medium businesses don't shut down. But part of that money in the United States alone will see about $2 trillion go to infrastructure. That $2 trillion, that's money that didn't exist in any of our economies. It's money that's largely being printed by our Federal Reserves, by our banks. If we have $2 trillion in the United States that is being put into the economy, we could either build back better in a way that moves away from a fossil fuel past, or we could stay in the negative way we've been. And I think what we are seeing in terms of the companies we work with, companies like Mars, companies like so many others that are joining us in the climate policy debate, and saying we have got to make sure that the mass majority of the kind of build back better money goes into clean technology, goes into smart climate practices and policy. And we're seeing more and more companies calling for that and calling for a price on carbon. So the energy, the emergency nature is greater. It's greater because COVID showed us how serious systemic shocks to our system is, and because we're witnessing, regrettably, every single day what's going on. Just as one example, today on the West Coast, where people can't leave their homes because of the forest fires and the ash outside, and day looks like darkness when they look out their windows. Climate change is with us now. It's real today. And hopefully we will learn that acting before it gets worse is a lot better than waiting until it gets worse and worse and worse.
Absolutely. Ezgi, let me get back to you. We heard from Barry there about some of the concrete, very specific conversations that have been happening at Mars since this crisis started. How in some ways it made his job in some ways slightly easier in terms of getting his message across. Can you tell us a little bit about some concrete measures that AB InBev has introduced or that you've managed to push through over the last 6 months, perhaps as a result of this crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. So, for us at AB InBev, our sustainability goals have never been more relevant than ever before. And if I can give a couple of them as examples, these are 2025 targets. We're looking to have 100% of our farmers to be skilled, connected, and financially empowered. Another one of our commitments is to have 100% of our products to be in packaging that is returnable or made from majority recycled content. The reason why I'm giving these two examples are these are mainly driven by communities and largely, vulnerable communities on both ends of our value chain, the smallholder farming communities on one hand and the recycling supply chain, the recycling communities on the other hand. And we have always put, that farmer-centric approach or that, the waste picker at the middle of our efforts as we're looking to bring, the recycled materials back into our products. But we have not really imagined how the programs we're putting in place and the relationships we're building are actually ensuring that resilience, without us even noticing. If I can give a specific example, some of the ways that we continue to support the farmers, because we put in place the remote programs, we were able to offer them health and safety trainings remotely. We were able to provide them with agronomic advice at the time when they needed it, when it was very critical for that crop management. Or, we were able to offer them access to better information, whether it's through radio or SMS, as opposed to meeting them in person because we couldn't. Other ways that, we were there for the farmers were ensuring that the buying sites were open and operating efficiently and safely so that we can continue to purchase, right? So that their livelihoods are not impacted, so that they can still have access to credit and inputs. And I think these are ways that, we established these programs, but a lot of them were done either in person or we were starting to put in place the remote mechanisms. And all of a sudden during the pandemic, we realized how critical these programs were, not only to ensure, that supply security, but to also ensure that community resilience. Ultimately, we're living and working in these communities, in these neighborhoods. So that's one end. The other end of the value chain, as I mentioned, the recycling communities, in many markets around the world, waste management and recycling services were not deemed as essential. So all of a sudden we saw these supply chains really disappear. So, we're working with our close partners in many markets around the world to ensure that they continue to operate, that they continue to have a livelihood, but also that we're managing that post-consumer waste. And we're ensuring that it goes back into one of our facilities or suppliers as opposed to, a landfill. So, a lot of these conversations are taking place. And I think now, again, more so than ever before, they feel more business critical. They were already business critical, but now the perception is that, yes, these are urgent. Yes, these are very much needed. Yes, these are material risks to our business. As Mindy mentioned, these are not initiatives that are siloed or standalone. These are actually truly integrated into the business and how we think about our role in society and how we want to be that engine for good. So those would be a couple of specific examples.
Mm-hmm. Barry, perhaps a question to you. So a lot of the things we're talking about, relate to the S part of ESG. So obviously the E part being environment and climate, but a lot of this is the S and I guess the G of ESG. The E part of ESG is relatively easy to measure. It's mostly emissions. It's pretty easy to empirically measure it. But as the S and the G parts of ESG become more important, come into the front seat along with the E part, how do you guys actually go around measuring your progress on a lot of these issues? Because again, these initiatives, sound great, but in finance and in the corporate world, we love to reduce everything down to a spreadsheet. Investors love to be able to see. Your investors love to see everything on a spreadsheet. How much of a challenge is it capturing this data and boiling it down into that sort of format that investors can digest, and indeed your customers can digest?
I think it's extremely challenging. And as you say, on the environment, the protocols around greenhouse gases have been established for quite a while. We can all measure in the same way our footprints and how we're doing. I think on the social side, that is not the case. And so we've to a certain extent, we've all been working it out for ourselves, and there isn't yet a consensus. The way we've thought about it, we're an agricultural company, and the vast majority of our impacts, risks, and opportunities are upstream of us in farming and a lot of people. So we have about 1 million farmers that supply us around the globe, and some of those are the most vulnerable people in the world. Smallholder farmers, extremely challenged and vulnerable. So we've set the goal of making a difference to 1 million people's lives, and we're tracking that, and it is one of the shareholders and the board's key metrics. So we said we're going to make a material, significant difference to 1 million people's lives in the first 10 years of our work, and we're plowing through that, and it comes through freeing people from human rights issues. It comes from improving working practices in factories upstream of us, and to a large extent, it comes from changing the income. Smallholder farmers, in many cases, we need to double or triple their income to get to a living income. And so, this is not trivial work. We're looking to transform supply chains to do that, re-engineering supply chains to get the farmers at the start of our value chain more of the value from that value chain, and we're measuring that as we go. So I guess the short answer is we're having to measure ourselves, and that must make it incredibly difficult for the investment community to measure the S component, frankly. And I think there's a lot more work to do on that. I think the G part is a little bit easier. There's plenty of rating agencies that can measure your governance in a way. So I really do think it's the S that's the hardest part here, and there isn't yet a consensus on how to do that really well.
Mindy, do you agree with that? And how do we reach a consensus? How far away are we from that?
Yeah, and maybe we reach a consensus, maybe we don't. Meaning there are so many issues, we've got to get on top of the ones that are most material to particular businesses. What's important to Mars or may not be important to Levi Strauss. But a few things, and again, I certainly not only agree with what my colleagues have said, but admire the steps they've taken for change. But on the S, little harder for sure, and there are multiple environmental issues under E. But on the S, how do people pay their employees? What are their wages? For people who are worrying about, as we just heard, what their farmers are making, and can they live and exist on the salary? That's a very clear S issue, and that may be whether you pay minimum wage in the United States or whether you're worrying about those in your supply chain and whether they're able to feed their children. Either way, it should be measurable, and people want to work for and buy from and be part of companies that are starting to address it. And it's human rights. What kind of practices do companies have? What kind of diversity? In the world that we're living in, regrettably, while the fires burn, the world of racism has just reminded us of how far we need to go. The expectations for companies has doubled, tripled, quadrupled since May. They truly are. Almost every large company is talking about how they're adding to their diversity team and who should be on their board. And they ought to be, and they need to be. We need to better represent the world around us. And I think corporations are out there trying to do just that. So you certainly could look at, what does the board of a corporation look like? Is it all white males who are 65 and 75 years old? Not that I have anything against those people, but where's the diversity of women, of people of color? And that is one way that you could rate boards. We offer courses through business school and law school on integrating climate and sustainability at the board level. The interest has quadrupled over the last year in terms of boards understanding their need to be more diverse, their need to set goals on sustainability and on human rights. And they're trying to figure out how to do that. And I agree, there's no perfect formula for any of these things, but people are now watching in a different way, including the owners, the investors of publicly traded companies. So whether the S is about human rights or making sure you'll never have traffic in your supply chain, children who are 11 years old sewing your products, we need to make sure that the large companies have standards and practices that assure that. And the companies on the show absolutely do. But you'd be surprised how much of that still exists. That too is part of what the S looks like. And we could go on and on. I wish there weren't so many S issues, but regrettably there are.
Yeah, if I can,
yeah, as you,
I was just going to add it.
yes.
Yeah, I was just going to add in there, if I can weigh in, I think one thing to note is that questions from investors are becoming a lot more thoughtful. They're way more action oriented, less of the check the box approach, and I think there is this growing awareness of greenwashing as well, which is, for sustainability professionals like ours who are really trying to create that local impact, it's really encouraging to see their engagement, their sophistication. So I just want to give a shout out there as well that, yes, the strongest focus is still on E. Yes, there is a growing interest in S, especially around human rights and D&I topics. And G, yes, there are many measures that can be taken into account, but the questions are really becoming a lot more thoughtful and forward-looking. And I think that's where the opportunity is for companies to continue to focus on material issues.
Got it. Well, unfortunately, we need to wrap up very soon, but I'm going to give you all one last very quick fire question. And I'll ask each of you in turn to give me, in this time of crisis, to give me and to give the audience one big reason to be optimistic, and also to very briefly talk about your biggest concern, your biggest worry right now. So Ezgi, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think we have many reasons to believe. I think what this pandemic has shown us, we still have very strong tailwinds. So let's remember that. I think the crisis is opening many doors for us to learn to be agile, to be flexible, to continue to invest in technology, but also in relationships and improving that transparency. So that we can continue to redefine how we do business, how we engage with our colleagues, with our partners, and local authorities. So I think for me, the time is to lean in right now, and we'll continue to do that. But we have many reasons to believe.
Biggest challenge, biggest worry?
I think the biggest challenge is, seizing the opportunity, like making sure that we're really capturing and we're benefiting from those strong tailwinds right now, and keeping the eye on long-term horizon.
Barry?
I think that keeping it macro, the thing that I find the biggest opportunity is just look at how we've all adapted in the last 6 months. I haven't been in an office in 6 months, and nor have any of my colleagues, and yet our businesses are running just fine. So we can adapt in a crisis. The problem we've got, I'll turn to the problem, is the world doesn't. The majority of the world doesn't yet see climate and these other things as a crisis. And so the problem, what worries me is we'll realize it's a crisis too late. But we are hugely adaptable if we can get aligned and work together on this stuff. And we've all seen that in the last 6 months.
Thank you. And Mindy, I'll give you the. I'll give you.
Quickly. I think COVID has shown us what we can do as well as what we can't do, and I think has energized us around the knowledge that a problem shouldn't be addressed after the fact, that we've got to act sooner rather than later. We could have avoided hundreds of thousands of deaths, or at least tens of thousands, and that we ought not to let happen again. A mistake, unfortunate and grave. So I think the response of learning what happens when systemic risk hits us is that people don't want that to happen again, and they're starting to act, and they're starting to see climate with the same immediacy. The downside is, even with all that we're seeing, and I am seeing extraordinary change every day from large companies and the investors we work with, it's got to be faster. It is all about pace and scale as we move forward to address sustainability issues. And it's about good business. This is not about hurting business, but it is about acting sooner rather than later.
Well said. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you so much for joining me today. That was a really stimulating and interesting conversation. Thank you.